Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Deanna Singh. Those of you who know the show know that Grace Under Pressure poses questions to thought leaders and doers like Deanna, who are making our world a better place. Grace Under Pressure focuses on what we call the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we feel toward, that we exert toward others. But when you do it as a leader, as Deanna is, you bring people together for common cause, and energize them with the power of your purpose and a shared purpose. So Deanna Singh, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
So wonderful. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, I want to tell everyone about you. So you, Deanna Singh, is the founder and chief change agent for Flying Elephant, which is a social impact holding company. It's known for giving audiences the tools and the courage to imagine, activate, and have a positive impact on the world. And that's all. Now, Deanna has a new book coming in next year, but she's got so much to talk about now that I wanted to have her on now. And her forthcoming book is called Actions Speak Louder. It's a Penguin Random House publication, which is pretty darn cool. So, Deanna, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
You know, we talk about kind of an idealistic thing of a community which is founded on mutual respect, understanding, and appreciation. What does that feel like when you have such a community? So,
I think that is the definition of belonging. If we think about what it means to be in a space where you feel like I can show up fully, people are going to listen to me, I know that I can listen to others, I know that I'm going to be valued. To me, that's really the definition of belonging. So when I think about that kind of a community, I think that that's where we're all trying to go, no matter what kind of organization we're in or the organizations that we participate in, the communities that we have. That's essentially what we're trying to get to.
Great. I love the word belonging because it's something I talk about when I talk about values. And I say that values define our belonging. And I think you just did it better than I've ever done. So thank you. So
I doubt that, John.
I'm going to get readers who know my show my book, Grace, and the R stands for respect. So how do we show respect for others? It's a topic I've written about and around, and I don't know that I've covered it perfectly, but what does respect for others mean, and how do we show it, Deanna? So,
I think that when people feel the most respected, it's when they feel like somebody has made an authentic investment in them. So when you are able to have, if that's a conversation, if that's giving some advice, if that's, whatever it looks like to pour into somebody, I think that's when we feel the most respected. My grandmother used to do this. She used to point her fingers like this, and she'd walk around and point her fingers out like this. And she would say, I see you. That is so powerful, right? Because when we're showing respect, essentially what we're saying to people is, I see you. Mm-hmm. Right? I see that you are there. I recognize that you are there. I acknowledge that you are there. It's important to me that you are there.
And I think I love that. And I love the way you told the story of your grandmother. That's great. Now I can see a grandmother doing those two fingers does also mean I'm watching what you do.
It could mean both things. It could definitely mean both things.
But anyway, the concept of respect is being able to view someone with an open heart. And I'll throw myself under the bus here because I am the world's worst person at making first impressions. So I'm most often wrong with first impressions. So that open-heartedness, how do we maintain that? How do we overcome our prejudices? And I'm not talking about the big, but just, I met Deanna once and she's not my type. So how do we fight against that, Deanna? So.
Well, I think one thing is just recognizing that you're having those moments, right? I think too often we are moving so fast in the world that we don't even stop to recognize that that's the kind of moment that we're having. And so one of the things that we always encourage people to do is first just slow down. Want to have a moment where you're responding to somebody and you can kind of feel that angst building, or it's you got this like a little bit, slow down and really think about, where is that coming from? Is it because I had a bad breakfast this morning and I'm bringing it out on this person? Is it because there's something that happened in the past that I'm holding on to that has been unresolved? Is it something inside of me, right? That maybe I do have some kind of internal bias that's going on. But the biggest thing I think is just slowing down and recognizing and training yourself to recognize when you're having those moments. Because too often, right, we call this like kind of implicit bias. Too often, it's happening in our unconscious mind, and the only way to bring it forward is to make it part of our conscious practice.
No, that's good. And I like your idea of slowing down, because that's something I preach, but don't tell anybody. I seldom practice. Don't tell anybody. That'll be our secret. But no, I think it is so important. And especially, I know in my coaching work, I work with senior leaders, and I know you do the same kind of thing. And time is the most precious resource. So, and the way our management culture so often pushes us is cut to the chase. What's the important? What's the bottom line? Well, that's a good discipline, but I think as you just expressed it, it causes us to be prejudicial in maybe macro and micro ways. Would you agree? So
absolutely. And it's unfortunate because I say this all of the time. I get to work with a lot of executive leaders, and I would say everybody is an executive leader of something, even if it's just yourself, right? But one of the things that I think we do not afford ourselves often, if at all, is the opportunity to have that kind of reflection. But if you look at some of the greatest leaders of our time and who have preceded us, one of the things they got really disciplined about was making sure that they created that time for reflection. And so whether that's creating the habits of in the moment reflection, or the bigger habits, right, of no, I'm going to set aside time every day to just sit with my thoughts and see where I'm coming at things. That is an incredible leadership skill. And I think it's one of the things that separates our strongest leaders, right? The ones that we really admire from those who are ragged, right? And kind of burnt out. I think that's one of the biggest things that I see as a differentiator.
No, that's important. And I always, when I hear reflection, a story comes to mind of a leader that I had the opportunity to interview and got to know, and Skip LaFoe, who was the man, General Motors executive, and created or built a Saturn motor company. And he wrote an article about reflection, and I said, Skip, I said, you're a busy guy. How do you make time for reflection? And he looked at me like I had two heads, and he said, you put it on your schedule. Yeah. And that's something I've taught a lot of executives. I mean, I've shared that lesson with them, and I know a lot of them who actually take an afternoon or a period of time, and it's regularly scheduled. Does that time get used up for other things? Sure, it does, but at least it's out there, and it's an aspiration, and on time it becomes a habit. So it's a good thing for us to do. I'm glad you mentioned reflection. So, great. So, you talk about, and it's become a commonplace word, or more commonplace a word, and that's ally. What does it mean to be an ally?
So the way that we define ally is uniting yourself with another to promote a common interest. And almost every single word in that definition is really important. When we talk about uniting, it means coming together with somebody else, right? So not from the outside, but walking along somebody with someone else. This happens between people. This does not happen at the individual level. This happens between people. And being able to promote a common interest, that there is something that even if it isn't part of your own experience, your own identity, your own opportunity, or things that are in front of you, that it is something that you share a common interest with the person that you're aligning. And so I think that's a really important definition. And it's one we spent a lot of time deciding which definition, because there's many of them out there, is what happens when people start using words frequently, right? Many definitions pop up. Sure. But the reason why we really ascribe to this one is because what it does is it talks about the action that we all have to take. That this isn't, when you're an ally, it is not something that is passive. It is not something that is done by yourself. It is not something that is done to benefit just yourself. Being in allyship really means that you are making that you're uniting, that it's with another person, and that you have something that you are, that's a common interest, right? Something that is bringing you together.
Great. I love that. I like the idea of how you've made it an action and rooted in action. You said several times uniting. Do you have to be equal to your ally? And what I mean by that, can a young person have an elder as an ally? So
absolutely. In fact, allyship across differences is the crux of it, right? Because what you're doing is you're showing up oftentimes in a context that might not be the one that you come from. So for a younger person showing up as an ally for an older person, or an older person showing up as an ally for a younger person, what they're saying is, I might not share the same identity with you, but I have a common interest and I care about you, right? We talked about at the very beginning, how do you create these relationships? How do you create this kind of investment in others? Allyship is one of the best ways to be able to create that kind of respect. Real grounding.
There's a term that I have become recently acquainted with, and shame on me, and it was taught to me by Fiona McCauley, who teaches at my alma mater, Georgetown, but she also runs the WILD Network, Women's Leadership Development, and she talks about sponsorship. And she gave me a definition of sponsorship as when they talk about you outside the room in a positive way.
Right.
Is that a form of allyship? Are you...
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm so glad. I also am a Georgetown grad. So Georgetown Law.
That's right. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. You went to law school, or am I hallucinating?
I went to the law school. Right.
Okay. Yep. You're more elevated than I am. I'm just an undergrad there.
Yeah. But yes, no, absolutely. I think it's really important. And I love when people make the distinction between mentorship and sponsorship. It's one of the things that we talk about quite frequently. Mentorship is, it could be a two-way mentorship, which is my favorite kind of mentorship, where someone says, I'm mentoring you, but I'm also here to learn. And I've created this kind of, conduit where we can grow together. And sponsorship is saying, you know what, I recognize that given all of the history that we have, given some of the, social dimensions that exist in the world, given the culture that we may even have within our own organizations, that there are some places where certain groups might not be represented. And in those places where I am represented and I can have a voice and I do have a microphone and somebody's turned it on and someone else is listening, that I'm going to use that platform as an opportunity to sponsor people who are not currently at that table. And it's a very, very powerful understanding both of them, having both of them work in tandem is incredibly beneficial. But I think it's important for people to understand those are two different things.
Great. Okay. Now it gets done because you touched on this and difference. So how can men become allies of women? So
I think both of those things we just talked about, right? That two-way mentorship. And again, the two-way meaning I can learn from you, you can learn from me is extraordinarily important. I think the other, idea of sponsorship, so saying I might not be able to mentor you into this role, but I can certainly, when people say, who's doing a good job? Who else might be interested in this? Who haven't we been paying enough attention to, that I can make sure that I'm sponsoring you in those conversations. And I'm being very intentional about what it looks like in those conversations. But I think that there's many other ways that you can do that. One of the other big ways that you can do some support of allyship for between men and between women is building relationships, right? That it might not be as formal as mentorship and that might not be as informal as sponsorship, but being intentional about saying, you know what, I'm going to do some learning. I'm going to go through my day today and I'm going to, this is a little task I gave to a CEO that I was working with. I said, what I want you to do, I want you to go through all the meetings that you have. He came to me with the question of, why am I having so much turnover in my senior leadership team of women? And I said, just do this little thing. I said, go into your meetings and on your paper, don't tell anybody what you're doing, but on your paper, in front of you, your agenda, I just want you to make tick marks every time a woman gets talked over, every time a woman's idea doesn't get elevated, every time somebody steals or co-ops a woman's idea, just make some tick marks. And I said, we'll talk next week and we'll have a conversation. He called me, I think, within like 24 hours. And there was no nice greeting, John. There was no, I pick up the other end of the phone. I thought, this is unusual. Like, well, we don't have a call for another week. What's going on? And he yells on the phone, why would anybody work here? I don't know why any women would work at this. Because what he
Yeah.
did was he put himself into a place where he could look at the way that the meetings were being run, the way that the day was functioning from a different perspective. And so I think doing that work of empathy, let me think about what it feels like to work in this office, to work on this team, to work on this project, to be in these meetings as fill in the blank, whatever identity, whether that's woman, person of color, right, LGBTQ plus, and think about what that lens, how that lens might shift what the experience is like.
What a wonderful exercise you did, because you took a pervasive problem and you gave it specific an action step that opened the door for this gentleman to say, whoa, now I see what you mean. Because I think, and this gets to the concept of privilege, and you can define it as white privilege, male privilege, whatever privilege. And I fall into both of those categories. And I like to say, well, I don't, it's just inherent in me, but that's overlooking the issue. So what does privilege mean?
So privilege is just a set of experiences really based on your social identity that are things that make the way that you show up in the world and the situations that you show up in the world different from others. I think it's really important to understand that everybody has privilege. You have privilege, Don. I have privilege too. We both share the privilege of having gone to a fine institution and having, high quality education as part of our background. We both share the privilege of having platforms where we can talk to large groups of people and talk to leaders on a frequent basis. Every one of us has certain kinds of privileges. I think the conversation about do we have privilege, do we not have privilege, is actually kind of it's like a myth. It's something that I feel like is kind of a waste of time. We all have some kind of privileges. I think a more fruitful conversation is, what do you do with your privilege? So the very fact that you invited me to be on your show and have this conversation with you is a demonstration of you taking the privileges that you have, the experience, the network, the community that you have, and saying, you know what, this is something that I want to elevate. This is a conversation that I want to elevate. This is a leader that I want to elevate. And I'm going to use my privileges to be able to do that. What a cool way to look at the world, right?
No, and that's great, and thank you. It is a privilege for me to have you on the show, so it's a two-way street, Deanna. And what you all, and I don't disagree with anything that you said, but for privilege, when you say privilege to me, it's not the school I went to or you went to, because in a sense that I, quote, earned it. Okay, I got good grades. Now, in my case, my parents paid my tuition, so that's privilege. Privilege to me, and so often becomes it's simply by birth, and that's something that we have to be, or the simple fact that I'm male. Doors open for me because I'm male, and that's the kind of privilege that we need to be more cognizant of. And I think that's the exercise that you gave the executive was one of that, because like me, I'm guessing he's white, and I'm guessing he's old. I mean, well, not older, whatever. And so, and I'm sure he's a good-hearted person. Otherwise, he wouldn't have engaged with you. But he wasn't getting it until you opened a door for him. So
yeah, and I guess what I would say is that there's privileges of all different kinds. What you're talking about, there are privileges that we are certainly born into because of our socioeconomic class, our structure, identity, how people perceive our identity, even, right, can be one of the privileges that we get. But there are some that we attain throughout life too. And I just think it's important, like what you just said, of what does it mean for me first to just even identify them and be okay with it? Like actually make a list. And this is one of the things we encourage people, make a list. It's okay. Because if you do that and you understand what your privileges are, that gets you one step closer to actually, if you acknowledge them, it gets you one step closer to using them as a mode for service. And that's really where I think the most power comes from. How do I use this as a mode for service?
I like that, a mode for service, which gets into our concept of servant leadership. And I heard a wonderful definition, a different one. I just had recently on my program, Sanyan Singh, excuse me. She she runs the Duke Leadership Center for Leadership and Ethics. And she interviewed retired Admiral John Young, and he talked about the notion of servant leadership, but he said something which it aligned with what you said. And he used a term I had not heard before, servant heart, which gets to intention. And I think that's something that essentially what you're talking about. The servant heart is the willingness to be open, or what my goals are toward others. So
absolutely. And what a beautiful way to live in the world. I was talking to a friend the other day, and they were talking about how when you are able to be part of somebody else's ability to thrive, I don't know that there's any other better feeling literally in the world. And isn't that where servant heart comes from, right? Isn't that what the concept looks like?
Right. Well, that's a form of respect. I'm looking at you as an individual with an open heart, and then I have a degree of compassion. And if you're in need, I want to be of service. At the same time, there's something for me too, because I have gratitude that I can do something.
Yeah.
That's important. So there's another question. It gets into bias, and I think you hit on it. You gave us two constructive ways to diagnose bias, but I want to touch on it again. One was, you said to the gentleman, the executive, was make some tick points about women being disrespected, and the other one was make a list of your privilege. Are there other ways we can grasp onto our biases, because we all have them? So.
Oh yeah. So one of the ones that I think is the most challenging bias, right, that we deal with. There's many different forms of bias, but one of them is status quo bias. And so one of the things that we have people do as an exercise is to sit back and think about, what are all the things that I use the following phrase for? Well, we've always done it that way. Right? Or it's always been this kind of a person. Or we always go there to do our recruitment. When you start to use that word, well, we always, that is a really great red flag for bias. And it's the status quo bias. And I think that it's one of the most deadly out there, because too often we get so comfortable in the way that things are that we're really not willing to look at the way things could be. And it's in that looking at the way that things could be that we create more inclusion and we create more belonging.
Well, I think that always bias, if I could use that term, it gets to the root of when you look at certain industries, and then when they're asked, well, why don't you have more women or more minorities? And they'll go, well, we don't find them anywhere. Well, and then it gets like, where are you looking? And that's the other point. And so that's a great exercise. We always do it, and we don't take enough time to reconsider that. So if I'm in that place, Deanna, and I say to you, I need help, what do I do? What constructive advice do you give for an executive or an organization? So
I would ask the question, why? And I would do it at least 3 times. Well, let's use your example. So we can never find, people of color to be in our roles, or we can't find women to join these roles. Why? Well, we can't find them. Why don't you think you're able to find them? Well, we go and we look at such and such and such place. Why are you looking at those places? Well, because, we have a connection. We have an alma mater. We have this. Why is that the only place that you're looking? Or why, right? And so you just start to ask this question of why, and you keep digging until people realize, I genuinely don't know the answer to that, right? Or I've gotten to an answer, but I recognize that answer is no longer feasible. Why did you do it that way? Well, we did it. I'll give you a really funny story. I'm sure people have heard this before, but there was like a couple generations of family in the kitchen, and they were trying to put together a big family meal. And the grandmother saw that the great granddaughter, pulled out a ham, and the edges were cut off the ham. And the great grandma said, why are the edges cut off the ham? And she said, well, because that's our family tradition. We always cut the edges off the ham. And then she says, well, why do you think we did that? And she says, well, I don't know. That's just our family tradition. She said, the reason why we did that is because our oven was too small. You've got this gigantic oven. Why are you cutting right the edges off? So I think that's a funny story, but it's one that always really sticks in my mind, because if you can get to the place where you're asking the great, whatever the equivalent is, right, of great grandfather, grandmother question of why did you do that? and you realize that it's no longer the case, we're no longer in the same environment, that's when you know you have an opportunity to change.
And that's, that's such a wonderful thing, because it's a great story. It makes me laugh. But it's being, that small oven then becomes the metaphor for the way the world was. And the world now isn't a small oven. It's a big oven. And there's lots of room. And if you keep operating with the mindset of a smaller oven, you're going to miss out. And if you don't respect or if you don't acknowledge the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not shame on you. You're missing out. You're losing. And that's the challenge. And it's thankfully we have people like you who can educate us in that regard. So.
Well, thank you. I do. I just feel very strongly that right now this is an imperative. It is not a nice to have, a touchy-feely, it is literally, I think, going to be the deciding factor of what organizations continue to thrive and those that don't. And
they will.
Today in my work.
It is a matter of social justice, yes, but it's also if you want to stay in business, you're going to have to change, because it's not, if you don't want to change, then just close up shop, because the world's changed. So
absolutely. And I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I make this distinction, John. It might be important for your listeners. I think that there is incredible work that people are doing in equity and inclusion and diversity work. Some of my greatest heroes are doing this work from a social justice lens. And I applaud them. I support them. I acknowledge them. I am their biggest cheerleaders. I consider myself to be a part of them in many aspects of my own personal life. I think that the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, what we try to help people and frame for people, is that this is a business strategy too. And to understand that there is a social justice component that happens in our policies, in our laws, in our, in our systems and our structures and all of that. But there is also what is happening between the walls of your building. And in this remote world, what is happening in your Zoom conference rooms, right? Or whatever platform you're using.
Right.
Because that world, it's not the social justice space, but it has many overlapping spaces. But this really is about what are you doing inside of your organization that's going to allow for you to continue to grow. Period.
You're absolutely right. And if an avenue to attain diversity, equity, and inclusion is through the business and financial imperative, go for it. Because once you get in the door, it changes forever. And that's the positive. And that's what we're going for, in my small opinion. So
I agree. And I mean, the first couple chapters of the book will be all about the business and the moral case, that these two things don't operate independently. They can't operate independently, and they shouldn't operate independently.
Wonderful. Now, unfortunately, we are racing toward the end of our show, Deanna. So I always ask our guests a story of grace. And do you have one you would like to share with us?
I do. So I had the great pleasure of going to Fordham University when I was an undergrad student. So lots of Jesuit education in me. And I was the first in my family to go to Fordham. And I remember I was very active as a high school student. I had a teacher's lounge, key. I had my own mailbox in the teacher's lounge. I mean, I was very, very, very active. And so I had a great relationship with our administration, and everything. And I had built up this rapport where I could just go in and talk to them. And so when I got to university, because I didn't have any other experience, I thought that, the president of the university was basically, in my mind, the equivalent to the principal of my small high school. And so I would, have things I wanted to share with him, and I would go to his office, and his secretary would say, he's not in. And I would say, okay, great. And I'd pull out a book, and I'd cross my legs, and I'd sit on his very fancy couch, and I would wait for him to come. And it wasn't until really, I would say probably, years after, and every, once in a while I could reflect back on this idea that he totally should not have acknowledged me in the way that he did. I never realized while this was happening, right? The 4 years that I was an undergrad, that how inappropriate it was, how it wasn't what you do when you're in the president's office, right? He never, ever did that. But what he did do was he made time to listen to me. He supported me. He wanted to hear what I had to say. He did so many things that when I look back on it, like, instead of saying, Deanna, you're wrong. This is not how we do things. You shouldn't have shown up here. Why are you sitting with your legs crossed on my beautiful couch? Don't you know this is not how we do business? Instead, he said, hey, Deanna, how you doing? What's on your mind today? And he gave me such a great boost of confidence. He talked about sponsorship. He called people and said, I got this student. Now looking back, I'm thinking he probably needed a break from me, but he got an internship and did all these other things that he did not have to do. And in that moment, as a leader, he made a choice that he was going to make an investment in me and he was going to sponsor me and he wasn't going to make me feel bad that I didn't really understand the protocols. And along the way, he kind of showed me. But he did it without ever making me feel like I didn't belong. And I think back on his leadership and the grace that he showed me in that moment. And it's something I aspire to do with other people, right? That in years to come, people will look back and say, oh my gosh, why did where you're just like kind of dumbfounded that somebody would be so kind to you. And that it helped me grow, right? It gave me exactly what I needed in the moments that I needed it.
What a wonderful, wonderful story of grace. And it showed what simple acts of kindness, yet an acknowledgement and affirmation of you as a young woman, but also he looked at you as someone from whom he could learn. I'm sure I'm going to interpolate on that. And that's great. But what a wonderful and kind and generous act. That's an exemplification of grace. Thank you. So, Deanna, how can people find you?
Well, I'm most active on social media on LinkedIn. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. You can also go to our website, which is upliftingimpact.com. So if you're interested in how you can take your actions and the things that you're doing and make sure that they're really in alignment with this idea of inclusion and belonging, we'd love to be able to support you in your journey.
Great. Deanna, it's been a pleasure to have you. And with that, we will go out.
Thank you.